The water was supposed to be crystal clear. That was the promise of Lake Tahoe. America's jewel, straddling the border of California and Nevada, sitting more than 6,000 feet above sea level in the Sierra Nevada mountains. For generations, people came from around the world just to stand at its edge and stare into it. Not at it, into it. Because on a calm day you could see 70, 80, sometimes 100 feet straight down into the blue. The bottom looked close enough to touch, even when it was fathoms away. That clarity was Tahoe's identity. It was what made the lake feel almost mythological, ancient, pristine, untouched. But in 2024, something changed. The water started dropping. Not gradually, not gently. It fell nearly 9 feet, pulling back from shorelines that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Rocky shelves emerged from the shallows. Old pilings, long swallowed by the lake, broke the surface again. The tide of blue retreated, and what it left behind was not the clean, sandy lake bed that people imagined. It was something else entirely, something that had been hidden for a very long time. When the divers went in, they were not prepared for what they found. To understand why Lake Tahoe dropped so dramatically, you have to understand the drought that preceded it. Scientists described it as the worst dry period the American West had seen in 1,200 years. Not 12 years, not 120, 1,200, the kind of drought that erases rivers, collapses ecosystems, and forces an entire civilization to confront how it has been using water. The Sierra Nevada snowpack, the vast frozen reservoir that feeds Tahoe every spring through melt, was catastrophically depleted. Less snow fell. What snow did fall melted earlier. The streams and rivers that normally rush into the basin through spring and summer arrived as trickles. And the lake, which holds 37 trillion gallons at full capacity, began to shrink. Tahoe is an unusual lake in many ways. It sits in a fault basin, shaped like a crescent, and reaches depths of over 1,600 feet in its lowest points. Most of that water never sees sunlight. Most of it never warms above 40 degrees. The surface shimmers and sparkles in the afternoon light, drawing millions of tourists every year. But the true Tahoe, the vast majority of it by volume, is a cold, dark, pressurized abyss that human beings have barely explored. When the water level dropped, it didn't reveal the deep. It revealed the shallow margins, the edges, the places where the lake met the land and where, it turned out, people had been disposing of things for decades. The divers who entered those shallower zones in early 2025 were volunteers with an organization called Clean Up the Lake. They had done this kind of work before. In 2021, they had conducted a 72-mile cleanup along the shoreline at depths between 0 and 25 feet, pulling out the kinds of things you'd expect to find near a popular recreation area. Lost anchors, beer bottles, sunglasses, fishing gear, the ordinary detritus of outdoor tourism. That 2021 effort had been considered a major success. It had removed tens of thousands of pounds of material from the upper reaches of the lake. But the 2025 project went deeper. Between February and July, the team conducted 29 dives over 14 cleanup days, using specialized equipment including diver propulsion vehicles, essentially underwater scooters, and nitrox breathing mixtures that allowed them to work more efficiently at depths between 35 and 55 feet. They covered 6 miles of lake bed and nearly 5 miles of shoreline in Placer County alone. And what they brought up over the course of those months was staggering. Nearly 2,000 pounds of debris, over 1,000 individual items, 248 glass bottles, 21 anchors, metal debris, plastic, recreational equipment of every description. And here is the part that should stop you cold. That was just one section of the lake, one county, one depth range. When scientists ran the numbers and extrapolated those findings across the entire lake, the estimates became almost incomprehensible. If the debris concentration found in that pilot area is consistent throughout Tahoe, there could be more than 29,000 pounds of litter and 17,000 individual items resting on the lake bed at similar depths. And that doesn't include the deeper zones, the areas between 55 feet and 1,600 feet, the sections that no volunteer dive team can safely reach with recreational equipment, the parts of the lake that remain almost entirely unexplored. When remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, began probing those deeper zones, the discoveries became harder to explain. The teams weren't just finding beer bottles and lost anchors down there, they were finding large objects, manufactured objects, things that had no business being at the bottom of a national treasure. Reports began emerging of what appeared to be corroded industrial barrels, dozens of them, then hundreds, resting on the lake bed at extreme depths. Their condition suggested they had been there for a very long time, decades, possibly. And based on their location and the patterns of their placement, the evidence pointed not to accidental loss, but to deliberate dumping. Someone, at some point in the not-too-distant past, had used Lake Tahoe as a disposal site. The history of industrial dumping in American lakes and rivers is long and largely shameful. From the 1940s through the 1970s, before modern environmental regulations existed, companies routinely disposed of waste in the most convenient way available, which often meant sending it to the bottom of the near-sink body of water. The chemicals sealed inside those barrels, whatever they were, had been slowly leaching into the cold water for years. Heavy metals, solvents, industrial compounds. The exact contents remained under investigation, but the implications for the lake's chemistry and biology were serious enough that researchers escalated their monitoring immediately. Lake Tahoe's legendary clarity of that quality that made it feel like glass, like a window into another world, had already been declining for decades before any of this was discovered. UC Davis scientists at the Tahoe Environmental Research Center have been measuring the lake's transparency since 1968, using a simple but elegant method. They lower a white disk into the water and note the depth at which it disappears from view. In the late 1960s, that disk could be seen at depths of over 100 feet. By 2024, it vanished at 62 feet. That's a loss of nearly 40 feet of visibility over half a century, despite billions of dollars spent on restoration efforts and decades of environmental protection policies. The 2024 Annual Clarity Report, released by UC Davis in June 2025, made for difficult reading. The researchers documented that clarity had dropped from 68 feet the previous year down to 62 feet. That's a 6-foot decline in a single year. And while the scientists were careful to note that this wasn't statistically outside normal variability, the broader trend was impossible to ignore. The lake was not improving. Despite everything that had been done, the stormwater controls, the erosion management, the invasive species removal, the air quality regulations, the clarity of Lake Tahoe had plateaued at a level roughly 40 feet worse than it was when modern records began. The director of the Tahoe Environmental Research Center, Dr. Stephanie Hampton, put it plainly. The lake is not getting worse in a statistically significant way at this moment, she acknowledged, but it is not getting better, and the scientists don't yet fully understand why. The leading theory for decades had been sediment, particles washed in from roads and construction sites, tiny suspended bits of soil and rock that clouded the water. Management efforts had focused almost entirely on reducing sediment runoff, and those efforts had indeed reduced the rate of clarity loss. But now, with the lake running warmer, with more wildfire smoke drifting across it every summer, with invasive species altering the biology of the water itself, researchers are beginning to suspect that the particles causing the current. Cloudiness may be different from what they were 20 years ago. Maybe it's algae now, not sediment. Maybe it's wildfire ash. Maybe it's a combination that no one has fully characterized yet. The wildfire connection is not a minor footnote. In 2021, the year the clarity measurements were at their all-time worst, massive fires burned across the Sierra Nevada range surrounding Tahoe. The smoke settled on the lake surface. The ash fell into the water. The runoff from burned hillsides carried blackened sediment down into the basin. Researchers saw the impact in their data almost immediately, a catastrophic spike in murkiness that took years to partially recover. Climate change is making those fires more frequent, more intense, and more destructive. The same warming that is reducing the snowpack and intensifying droughts is also creating the dry, hot, wind-driven conditions that turn forests into infernos. For Lake Tahoe, the threats are not isolated. They are interconnected in ways that make simple solutions nearly impossible. Then there's the threat that arrived in 2025 and sent shockwaves through the entire conservation community around the lake. Golden mussels. This particular species of invasive mollusk had been discovered in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta in the summer of 2024, marking the first time it had ever been recorded in North American freshwater. Within months, agencies responsible for protecting Lake Tahoe were treating it as a potential catastrophic threat. Golden mussels reproduce explosively. They filter enormous quantities of water, which sounds like a benefit, but in practice strips the water of the phytoplankton that forms the base of the food web. They clog intake pipes, damage boat hulls, carpet the lake bed in thick mats that smother native species. In other parts of the world where they have been introduced, they have caused ecological devastation on a scale that took decades to even partially reverse. In response, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and the Tahoe Resource Conservation District enacted emergency measures in March 2025. Mandatory decontaminations were added on top of the mandatory boat inspections that had been in place since 2008. The result was dramatic. Inspectors performed more than 4,700 decontaminations in 2025, a 60% increase over the previous year. 72 watercraft were intercepted carrying invasive species before they could enter the lake. Any one of those boats, had it slipped through, could have introduced organisms that would have altered Tahoe forever. The lake had already spent years fighting off other invaders. Asian clams had established populations in the warmer, shallower bays. Crayfish, non-native to the basin, had spread through the near-shore zone, disrupting the food web and churning up sediment with their burrowing. Aquatic invasive plants had taken hold in certain coves and required expensive, labor-intensive removal campaigns to keep in check. Each new invader added another layer of stress to an ecosystem already under pressure from above and below, and the divers conducting the cleanup work in 2025 confirmed that those existing invasive species were still present throughout the lakebed they surveyed, even as they gave the cautious good news that no new species had been detected in the areas they explored. But let's return to the depths, because the story that captured the world's attention, the thing that made people who have never visited Lake Tahoe stop and listen, was not the pollution data or the clarity measurements. It was the discovery that the lake had been keeping secrets, human secrets. Lake Tahoe has long been the subject of dark legends, the kind that circulate around any body of water deep enough and cold enough to preserve what it swallows. The local Washoe people, who have lived around the Aimaha lake for millennia, speak of powerful spirits that inhabit the depths, entities they call water babies, said to lure the unwary into the water and drag them down. These stories are ancient, woven into the culture of the people who knew this place before anyone else. But in the modern era, the legends took on a different character. There were whispers about organized crime, about bodies, about the lake being used by criminal organizations during the mid-20th century as a place to make people disappear permanently. The cold, oxygen-poor water, the thinking went, was the perfect preservative. Put something down there, and it stays. For most of Tahoe's history, these stories existed in the same murky zone as urban legends. Colorful, plausible enough to repeat, impossible to verify. The lake is too deep. The water is too cold. Visibility decreases rapidly with depth. Without ROVs and purpose-built exploration equipment, what lies at 1,600 feet is simply unknowable. But the lake had already proved that its cold waters could preserve things far beyond their expected lifespan. In 2011, divers operating at 265 feet recovered the body of Donald Christopher Windecker, a scuba diver who had vanished 17 years earlier during a dive. Windecker had disappeared in 1994. His remains, still encased in his wetsuit, were found nearly 2 decades later in a state of remarkable preservation. The cold, the pressure, the oxygen-deprived conditions had essentially mummified him in place. His identity was confirmed. His family finally had answers. But the discovery raised a question that no one had satisfactorily answered. How many others might be down there? The new generation of deepwater exploration, enabled by the same falling water levels that had exposed the shallow debris fields, began systematically surveying areas that had never been mapped. And the findings were enough to keep researchers working around the clock. The large objects seen in the deeper zones, the corroded barrels, the shapes on the sonar that didn't match any natural geological formation. None of it had a simple explanation. None of it could be dismissed as ordinary lake sediment or recreational debris. And as each new scan added detail to the picture, the story of what Lake Tahoe had been hiding, and for how long, began to come into focus. What emerged was not just the story of pollution. It was the story of a lake that had been taken for granted. For the entire second half of the 20th century, as the resort towns around Tahoe grew and prospered, as the casinos on the Nevada side drew millions of visitors every year, as the ski resorts carved their runs into the surrounding mountains, the lake itself was treated as an asset to be used rather than an ecosystem to be protected. Development came first. The lake came second, or third, or not at all. Stormwater ran off parking lots and rooftops and directly into the basin, carrying with it the accumulated chemicals of modern civilization: motor oil, fertilizers, heavy metals, road salts. Construction on steep mountain slopes sent rivers of sediment cascading into the lake every time it rained. And beneath the surface, in the quiet, in the cold, in the dark, everything accumulated. The conservation efforts that began in earnest in the 1980s and 1990s were real, and they were not without effect. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, created jointly by California and Nevada in 1969, became a genuinely powerful regulatory body with the authority to limit development in the watershed. Billions of dollars from state and federal sources, from private conservation organizations, from the tourism industry itself, were invested in stormwater management, stream restoration, erosion control, and invasive species removal. The rate of clarity loss slowed. The trend lines, if you squinted at them in a certain way, looked like they were stabilizing. But stabilizing is not the same as recovering. And the discoveries of 2024 and 2025 made it undeniably clear that stabilizing is not enough. The 2025 Diver Cleanup Project did something beyond just removing debris. It documented, for the first time with scientific rigor, the true scale of the problem in the lake's mid-depths. The team's preliminary analysis, the extrapolation that projected 29,000 pounds of litter across the entire lake bed at similar depths, was designed not as a definitive statement, but as a planning tool. It told future cleanup operations what scale they needed to operate at. It told policymakers what kind of investment would be required. It told the public that the lake they thought they knew, the pristine alpine jewel in its granite basin, was carrying a burden of human waste that no single cleanup effort could address. And yet there was something moving about what those divers did. 26 volunteers, 480 hours, nearly 2,000 pounds of debris recovered by hand, one object at a time, from a cold, dark lakebed. The bottles and anchors and pieces of recreational equipment they pulled out of the water became the raw material for an art installation called Trashcade, a sculpture made entirely from what they had recovered, displayed at the Gatekeepers Museum in Tahoe City. The students who helped create it, 657 of them from schools around the basin, learned something that no textbook could teach as effectively. They learned that the lake was alive and fragile, and in need of people who cared enough to do hard, unglamorous work in its service. By early 2026, the rains had returned. The storms that moved in from the Pacific through the winter months were unlike anything the region had seen in years, heavy, sustained, relentless. The snowpack built back up in the mountains. The runoff came pouring down into the basin. 16 billion gallons poured into the lake between mid-February and early March alone. The water gauge climbed. The shorelines that had been exposed for months were slowly reclaimed. The rocky shelves that had emerged during the drought disappeared back beneath the surface, along with the newly accessible lakebed that researchers had been racing to document. The lake, as it rose, concealed its secrets again. The barrels in the deep, the unidentified shapes on the sonar screens, the preserved evidence of decades of negligence and deliberate dumping. The water rose over all of it, and Tahoe became once again the shimmering blue mirror that visitors expect to see when they arrive from Sacramento or Reno or Los Angeles. Beautiful, serene, ancient-looking. But the researchers didn't stop. They had the data, they had the sonar maps, they had the photographs and the samples and the chemical analyses. The brief window that the drought had opened, the months when the water was low enough to access areas that were normally unreachable, had given them something invaluable, a glimpse of the truth beneath the surface, and that truth was not going to be ignored just because the lake had refilled. The current state of Lake Tahoe is a paradox. It is, by almost any measure, healthier than it was in 1970. The blatant pollution of the mid-20th century, the raw sewage that was once discharged directly into the basin, the unchecked development on the steep slopes above, has been dramatically curtailed. The regulatory framework is real, and it has teeth. The scientific monitoring program run by UC Davis is among the most rigorous applied to any lake in the world. The conservation community around Tahoe is large, well-funded, experienced, and deeply committed. And yet, the lake is not getting better. Its clarity has plateaued at a level that would have been considered a crisis in 1968. Its depths contain decades of accumulated debris and, apparently, far more deliberate dumping than anyone had previously acknowledged. Its warm, shallow bays are occupied by invasive species that resist every effort to fully eradicate them. Its watershed is getting hotter, drier, and more fire-prone with every passing decade. And beneath its surface, in the cold, in the silence, in the absolute darkness of its deepest zones, there are things that no one has fully mapped, fully identified, or fully understood. What happens to Lake Tahoe now depends on decisions being made at every level, in state legislatures and federal agencies, in the offices of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, in the research labs at UC Davis, in the conference rooms where water managers negotiate over the allocation of a shrinking resource. It also depends on something less formal and less institutional. It depends on whether the people who visit the lake and live near it and love it understand what they are actually looking at when they stand at the water's edge and peer down into the blue. They are looking at something irreplaceable. A lake that took millions of years to form, filling slowly in its granite basin, developing an ecology of extraordinary complexity and fragility. A lake that the Washoe people knew as Da-Oe-Gay, the edge of the lake, sacred place, a place of power, a place that demanded respect. A lake that the rest of the world discovered in the 20th century and fell in love with, and in the process of loving it, damaged in ways that are still being tallied. The divers who went into that cold water in 2025, the volunteers with their propulsion vehicles and their nitrox tanks, hauling bottles and anchors and unidentifiable pieces of metal off the lakebed, were not naive. They knew they weren't going to fix the lake in a single season. They knew that the 29,000 pounds of debris they estimated was still down there would take years and enormous resources to address. They knew that the real threats, the warming climate, the intensifying droughts, the invasive species, the chemical contamination from the barrels in the deep, were not problems that could be solved with a cleanup dive. But they went anyway, because the alternative, knowing what's down there and doing nothing, is not something that people who love a place can live with. Lake Tahoe is still there. It is still, on most days, extraordinarily beautiful. The winter storms of 2026 have refilled it, and from a distance, on the right afternoon, it still looks the way it always has. That impossible blue, that sense of depth and stillness and permanence. But underneath the surface, the investigation continues. The sonar is still scanning, the samples are still being analyzed, the researchers are still trying to understand what exactly is in those barrels, how long it has been leaching, and what it has done to the chemistry of the water that millions of people swim in every summer. The secrets that dropped water levels briefly brought to light are not going back to sleep. The lake rose again, as lakes do, and covered what it had briefly revealed. But the knowledge is out there now. The maps have been drawn, the samples have been taken. The weight of what was found, literally and figuratively in pounds of debris and in the gravity of what it means, has been recorded. What Tahoe needs now is not just scientists and divers and regulatory agencies, though it needs all of those things urgently. What it needs is for the people who look at it and feel something, that catch of breath, that sense of awe that an ancient lake can still produce. In a human being who is paying attention, to understand that feeling is not just aesthetic. It is a responsibility. The clarity of the water is not just beautiful. It is a measure of whether we are keeping our promises to the places we claim to love. 62 feet. That's how far down you can see in Lake Tahoe today. It used to be over 100. The difference between those two numbers is the story of what we have done to one of the most remarkable places on Earth. The question now is whether we have the will, the knowledge, and the time to write a different ending.